Hi, I'm Amanda, and this is my final presentation. It's entitled It's a Giant, a look at one teacher's conflicting perceptions of multimodal literacy. I worked with Cassie in a single case study format. She is a preschool teacher of 3-year-olds in Cheyenne, and she graduated from the University of Wyoming 2 years ago. My research question was, what are one preschool teacher's perceptions of multimodal literacy and its use in her classroom? And this is a very small sliver of what I might do for my dissertation. And so the idea came from kind of trying out some of the ideas on a very, very small scale. So for the literature review, it's much grander than this, but I'm just going to do four kind of key points for you today. And so the first is that quite often multimodal literacy is synonymous or kind of only discussed in relation to technological uses of literacy within the research. There's so much research out there talking about multimodal and creating digital texts and creating iMovies and PowerPoints and eBooks and all these things. However, it's so much more than that, and the more than that quite often isn't talked about. And I really like Walsh's 2010 definition, which is that it's a process of meaning making through the reading, viewing, understanding, responding to, and producing and interacting with multimedia and digital texts. And so that term multimedia really brings in the other. And so that's the idea that there's two different forms of media and two or more different forms of media. So think about like a graphic novel. You have the pictures and then you have the text going along with it, or a comic book, or a picture book for that matter. Think about an example of a song and a piece of art. If you listen to the song by itself, you're going to garner one meaning from it. If you look at the piece of art by itself, you're going to garner one meaning from it. If the artist puts it together and they say you're supposed to listen to this song as you look at this piece of art, that's going to it's going to create an emphasis on different aspects of meaning that you might not otherwise have noticed. So that whole idea of creating meaning from multiple modes. The second thing is that it's important for teachers to be literate in multiple modalities because our students really do see them everywhere. And this is where the technological influence comes in, because our students can't be on the computer for very long without engaging in multimodal text. From PowerPoints, like the one that I'm showing you guys right now, you're listening to my voice, you're looking at an image, you're looking at text. To memes, they're really quite often great examples of multiple modes, to social media, to watching TV and TV ads, to playing video games. They engage with these multimodal texts all over the place every day. And for that matter, multimodal literacies can also lead to increased student engagement in classroom activities. I cite one study here, but this pops up all over the place in the literature, in that giving students the opportunity to create these alternative forms of text is often quite engaging for them, and you can get a significant upturn in student buy-in. So the last thing is that there's three main theoretical perspectives on multimodal text. First, text is a visual object, and so then you're noticing and naming the visual elements, you're creating perceptual inventories. Text is a multimodal event. There you're considering the compositional and spatial relations. You're looking at how the modes interact with one another and play with each other and associate and affect each other. And then the last thing is a sociocultural artifact. And there you're really looking at the site of production, so who made it, the site of reception, who's viewing, engaging, reading, interacting with it, and how that impacts the text. And then also you often adopt a critical lens like gender, or race, or power. You look for representations and stereotypes and that sort of thing. So for my methods, I did an 1.5 hour long initial interview where we talked about everything related to multimodality under the sun, along with kind of juxtaposing it against literacy and saying, so what's multimodal literacy versus literacy? So what multimodal practices are in your classroom? So what do you think, I had her define multimodal literacy. We talked about kind of a day in the life of teacher in relation to multimodal literacy. Then I did document collection. I have lesson plans, teacher notes, and student work. I did a classroom tour. They weren't a big fan of me coming into the classroom when the students were there, so but they had no problem with me coming in on an off day. So we went in on a Saturday, and it was actually quite useful that way because we were able to go around to kind of each corner of the room, and she would talk about how different things were used, how students engaged with them, how she engaged with them, and then we talked about the multimodal kind of literacies that occur around those objects and those activities. And that kind of flows into the last thing, which is a whole bunch of follow-up conversations and informal interviews that were noted in my researcher notebook, all the way from this data collection through the data analysis process. So for data analysis, I open coded for themes, and I found 4 of them, 3 within all aspects, and then a 4th really appeared through comparing the interview to other data. And then I went back and kind of sifted through to see if there were any examples of these themes that I had missed on my initial coding. And then I triangulated my findings across all the forms of data I collected. And then I member checked with Cassie all throughout this process with follow-up conversations. And that really actually strengthened my 4th theme through these follow-up conversations with her. All right, so for findings and discussions. So there are 4 themes, like I said. The first is that it's giant, the title of it. So she really talked about the vastness of literacy on several occasions, calling literacy, multimodal literacy, on several occasions calling multimodal literacy giant. That it was a very big thing, that it was everything, that it was huge, that it was all encompassing. And so she had this very, very broad definition of multimodal literacy, which is interesting when you compare it to a couple other themes. And so the second is that that it was very tactile. And so she would often say, we are 3. We need to feel our letters. We need to move. Literacy was very active and tactile. She had glitter letters on the wall where students had to feel the letter shapes, the shapes that the letter made, run their fingers along them. They would walk across the letters on the floor. She was planning to buy a series of carpets that had the letters as like roads so that they could drive their cars along it. Another example was that they had these story rocks where little pictures were glued to them of a girl, a boy, a house, and the kids could arrange them, etc. And the kids could arrange them and kind of tell their own stories. So all in all, there the very lots of movement, feeling, touching in her definitions of multimodal literacy and experiences with her students. However, she also made it very text-centric. She always had to relate it back to text, and specifically the alphabet quite often. And so for the story rocks, she said they only kind of counted because they couldn't read yet, and they couldn't read the stories, and they couldn't write the stories, and that they would count less over time. This oral storytelling was just because they couldn't do the other versions of storytelling yet, which I found very interesting with her definition of multimodal literacy being giant. And then all of her other examples in initial interviews, in the initial interview and initial thinking, were very much centered around letters. Or she might expand it and talk about menus and signs and these kind of place-based text, but they still always included text in one way or another. And then the last thing really occurred. This is the theme that emerged as I compared the interview and her initial thoughts to looking at her lesson plans in her classroom, is that she engaged in so much more multimodal literacy throughout her day, and her students engaged in so many more multimodal literacy practices than she thought. And that maybe 1/3 of the practices showed up in the initial interview and 2/3 showed up in the lesson plans in the classroom tour. And she wouldn't have even necessarily labeled those as multimodal literacy until we took the time to discuss them and look at them in that different light. So lastly, for my conclusions, the first is this kind of contradictory or competing beliefs. And this is really shown in her definition of literacy, multimodal literacy being giant, but then yet she focuses it in such a narrow literacy centric and even, narrower reading and writing centric in that definition of literacy, a reading and writing centric focus, despite the idea that this overarching belief that multimodal literacy was giant. And I found that kind of disconnect very, very interesting to look at. The second was that it was very context specific. So the research all talks about technology, but she didn't mention any technology at all aside from occasionally watching movies. For her, it was so specific to her 3-year-old needing to touch things so that it was tactile, needing to move so that it was active. And so it was a very specific focus. And I don't think the answer um, would have been the same if she was teaching different grades. Now that's conjecture and not going to be in my paper, just my thoughts. Um, so then the last thing is that after reflecting on practice, she saw so much more. So it wasn't until she was reflecting and looking really closely at her practice that she saw how much multimodal literacies were in her everyday classroom experience. And so it was really important for her to see these and to name these and to begin to make these explicit for the students. And so lastly, I had several limitations. I had a single case study. It was a preschool setting. So that's a very specific context. It's going to be different in a classroom. And then I wasn't able to do classroom observations, which I really would have loved to do and hoped to do with my dissertation. So here are my references, just so you see them. And thank you so much for listening to this really long presentation. And I hope you have a great day.